Okay, so hello, good evening, dobrý večer, vítajte v poradí štvrtej prednáške tohoročnej série reflexí architektúry, ktorá je venovaná britskej architektonickej scéne. I will switch to English right now. So welcome to the fourth lecture of the series of reflections on architecture, which is devoted this year to architects and writers and historians and whoever it might be from the British scene. And this is really a great pleasure to me to have here today writer, critic, and essayist and architecture, let's say historian, if I can put it like that, Owen Hatherley. So I can call him my colleague because I guess I can count myself in that team as well. So this is really a pleasure that we will have a different perspective on what is going on or what was going on in British architecture right now or few tens years ago. And what is also very interesting and why is Owen here, that he's somehow connected with Central Europe and particularly also with Slovakia, as he did some research, some important research on architects who emigrated from Central Europe to Great Britain before the Second World War. So, I mean, there are many issues we have in common, and I hope we will touch these issues during the lecture. Owen, I'm very happy that you are here, that you accepted the invitation, and now the floor is yours, and I'm very much looking forward to your speech.
Thank you. This is quite nice to have a sort of proper lecture hall like this. It feels very sort of old school pedagogical. I'm going to be talking about one book project, but I should probably introduce myself a little bit first. So, sort of write various places over the last, what year are we in? 16 or 17 years. Largely often about architecture. Not always about architecture, but sort of various subjects of which architecture often ends up being at the heart of. And for the most part, they deal with two geographical spaces, which are where I'm from, which is the sort of currently particularly insular island to your northwest, where I come from, and also the region in which you are in. So I wrote several books about sort of British architecture, initially mainly, well, what they tended to do was kind of hold up the architecture of the 1950s to the 1970s as a sort of alternative to the architecture of the last sort of 20 years. They were a sort of revisionist history combined with critique of the time. The first of those got translated into Czech, but not into Slovak, which is obviously appalling. But they kind of hinged on this sort of particular kind of juxtaposition of time periods, which I then decided was a bad idea after all, and sort of wrote a book, a sort of self-critiquing book about nostalgia called The Ministry of Nostalgia. But around the same time, I was sort of working on what ended up being a few books about, the nomenclature is sort of shifts around really existing socialist, state socialist, communist, Marxist-Leninist states in Europe. So that was particularly in a book published in 2015 called Landscapes of Communism, in which Bratislava featured quite heavily. But what I want to talk about is a sort of later project which was published earlier this year, which was sort of an attempt to kind of try and write a non-polemical book. And obviously, if you're writing a book about immigration in Europe in the 2020s, particularly if you're writing a book about immigration in the 2020s in Britain, you're going to end up being political no matter how hard you try not to be. But it wasn't explicitly so. So it's a book about people who migrated from Central Europe, largely using the definition of the early 20th century rather than the definition of the early 21st century. So Central Europe does not include Estonia. Anywhere that's like mostly east of Belarus, I don't think really counts as central. But it kind of comprises the sort of, roughly speaking, the central powers of World War I. The former, then still extant German Empire, and the former and then still extant Habsburg or Austro-Hungarian Empire. I kind of yoked bits of Western Poland into it because it seemed to make no sense to me to have Western Poland but not Eastern Poland, but otherwise that's the kind of the remit. Who kind of migrated from around 1933 until about 1946. So I think the last migrations that I write about are those, briefly, of the typographer Jan Schichold and the highly talented Polish graphic designer Romek Marba. But they kind of go back as far as the sort of early 1930s and people sort of first starting to kind of move to Britain to take part in its cultural scene, such as it was in the 20s and 30s, which wasn't much. What I'm going to do today is kind of extract everything other than the architects, first of all. So it's a book that's actually about artists, filmmakers, photographers, town planners, philosophers, economists, not musicians, which I rather regretted, and I'm kind of trying to get musicians into a future edition. But I'm kind of taking all of those out and concentrating just on the architects because, otherwise we'd be here all day. And the other thing I want to do is extricate the Germans, because the Germans are often at the kind of become the heart of the story rather unnecessarily because of the mythology of the Weimar Republic, because of the mythology of Berlin, above all the mythology of the Bauhaus, and that because of this, they are kind of used as a sort of stand-in for everything that's happening in the region. So Germans don't make up a majority of the people in the book by any means, but there's a lot of them. But I've decided this evening to remove the Germans. As a project, I think it was very, very influenced by, and I don't know if I cited this, but I probably should have. It was very, very influenced by a book that was published about 10 years ago by the architecture historian Ezra Aksan called Architecture and Translation, which was about the way that the architecture of the 1920s in Germany had been adapted when various German architects, most famously, obviously, Bruno Taut, the great expressionist and socialist modernist, moved to Turkey, that their architecture began to be sort of adapted to the technologies of the time, the cultures of the place, it sort of morphed into a different architecture in that process of translation. It wasn't the same thing in 1938 in Ankara as it was in 1928 in Berlin. And pretty much the same applies for the architecture in 1928 in Brno and the architecture in 1958, let's say, in London, even when it's being designed by the same people. So that kind of process of a sort of it sort of relies very much on the idea that there are cultural differences, that they are actually real things. That's a bad thing, but that it's a real thing. And that particularly at that point, people found people from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland, who are my subjects, that they found Britain to be a deeply, deeply alien and weird culture. Sort of backward and parochial, but also technologically advanced, urban, but also obsessed with the rural, wealthy, but cold, particularly the heating. The heating was is a thing that comes up again and again and again. People who moved from this part of the world to my part of the world at that point in the 1930s were amazed at the lack of central heating and the invention of the sash window, a window which essentially could never entirely be closed. So it would always sort of let in a breeze at all times. So those cultural differences are kind of at the heart of this. So we're going to sort of talk about some examples, architectural and non-German, for about 45 minutes or so, maybe longer. I'll try not to be too much longer. The reason why I'm starting with this flyer for an exhibition in 1944 in the Midlands industrial town of Leicester, which happens to have, incidentally, the finest German 20th century painting collection outside of Germany and New York, for reasons that I go into at length in the book, but need not detain us here, is the use of this term mid-European art, which at that point, most of the art that was in this collection that I've been kind of putting together for a few years, mainly from the collection of a sort of an emigre family of business people and art collectors in Erfurt, that about half of it, maybe more, was German, but you didn't want to draw attention to that in 1944. You wanted to draw attention to the fact that it also included our allies, like the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Poles. The Hungarians were a somewhat different question. So that kind of idea of sort of extricating that and having this kind of mid-European thing, sort of what I'm going to try and do today. So there are two kind of emigre architects who are kind of folk heroes in Britain. They're the subjects of sort of novels, of posters, of murals. One of them gets portrayed as a James Bond villain in a roundabout route. They're really, really, really kind of crucial figures in 20th century British culture. And I want to kind of briefly talk about them at the start because the way their stories are told, I think is an interesting one about the sort of particular way that a sort of romantic version of this narrative exists. So the first of these two people is Bertold Lebetkin. And Bertold Lebetkin, actually very, very tenuously Central European, but he studied architecture at the Technical University in Warsaw and first practiced in Frankfurt, so I'm going to claim him. But Bertold Lebetkin was from Tbilisi, from a Polish Jewish family. Studied at the famous, later to be described as Soviet Bauhaus for Hutemas, under Rodchenko and co. And his mythology in British life really kind of revolves from the early 30s on, when he comes over, as him being an emissary from the revolution. That he's someone who kind of, he kind of migrates ever further westward. Sort of born in Tbilisi, moves to Moscow, moves to Warsaw, moves to Frankfurt, moves to Paris, moves to London, and eventually then moves to like the rural areas outside Bristol, where he runs a pig farm. But Lebetkin, he's sort of someone who, in theory, sort of brings the revolutionary art and the revolutionary politics that was really very much not a part of British life in the 20s into the heart of British culture. And I really can't exaggerate how much that wasn't part, by the way. Although there were some interesting experiments before the First World War, the kind of modern movement of the 20s, simply Britain was not part of it in any way, shape or form. Probably like Romania was more connected to what was happening in Germany and Czechoslovakia and the Netherlands and the Soviet Union, which were the kind of, I think, the four countries that were really at the heart of the modern movement, than Britain was. Britain, I don't think it was ever as detached from European culture as it was in the 20s, except possibly the last 10 years. So really a lot of this is there's sort of moments in British history where the Channel kind of becomes a wall culturally, and even sort of actually to a degree. And that is, one reason for writing this book. So Lebetkin, this is one of his earlier buildings, is co-designed with the Belarusian architect Ivan Volodko, and it's a sort of demountable trade pavilion for the Soviet trade delegation. The first time it was built in Bordeaux, later re-erected in Strasbourg, then in Marseille. And it's sort of constructivist architecture for export. It's a sort of demountable, cheap version of the architecture which was has sort of emerged after a few years out of the October Revolution. And very quickly, when he arrives in Britain, he starts to kind of translate this architecture, not so much in aesthetic, which remains quite hard line, but in the kind of typologies he adopts. So one of the first really great Lebetkin projects is in Plumstead, in the kind of dockside area of southeast London, and is a row of terraced houses, which of course is an extremely English typology. And you can see a particularly kind of egregious pebble-dashed Victorian house next to these. But that kind of sense of sort of using the local typology starts quite early on. But Libetkin is generally sort of discussed as a tragic figure because of the fact that, I think he's one of those that genuinely believes that after 1945, Britain and countries like it would go on to construct socialist societies of one sort or another. Not necessarily on the Soviet model. There was a reason why Libetkin, although he regarded himself as a Marxist, did not live in the Soviet Union. He had very few illusions about what the Soviet Union was. However, he was very, very, very firmly on the far left and was very, very disappointed by the kind of consumer society that eventually emerged out of the war in Britain. This is one of his very, very late housing estates, which you can see these kind of quite sort of Baroque town planning ideas start to kind of come in while being built with very, very kind of cheap and basic construction technology. And a lot of his ideas are kind of plunged into kind of quite extraneous things. You'll get these kind of like concrete panel, quite cheap blocks of flats that have these incredibly elaborate staircases in the middle, where you get the sense that Libetkin's kind of poured all of the kind of energy and all of the ideas and lots of the money into designing these incredible sort of half Baroque, half constructivist staircases, whereas the rest of the buildings, they're all right. So that's sort of one version of the narrative is, someone kind of comes over and he brings the socialist modernist gospel, he's very disappointed, he kind of withdraws into himself. The other version is, I guess, one more of sort of success of a sort, which is that of the Hungarian architect Erno Goldfinger. And Goldfinger, one of the most interesting architects of the time, really, but he's quite hard to pigeonhole. His architecture owes most really to a kind of French modernist tradition around Auguste Perret. Very, very high quality concrete construction, often kind of trabeated, not the sort of Le Corbusier kind of Wiesenhof-Siedlung kind of white walls and render style, which he described as Caspar architecture. He was very critical of Libetkin, who he described as a Caspar architect, and that he was not a Caspar architect, he was a modern architect. And Goldfinger is interesting because he kind of flips this story where you have someone kind of brings the gospel, and they're gradually disappointed. And that his early work is kind of more compromised in Britain, and then it becomes more and more radical as time goes on. So this is the inside of his house at Willow Road in Hampstead, which is a sort of, again, a terrace of houses in a very kind of upper middle class area of London, which he filled with modern art. It's currently owned by the National Trust, so you can visit it. He wrote quite widely and well, which is always unusual for architects, and he was involved in a book that explains to a mass audience the County of London plan that was compiled at the end of the Second World War, which kind of imagined lots of London being reconstructed like this, which never happened, thankfully. But you can kind of get a sense of, this is very kind of Athens Charter modernism, which is kind of relatively sort of joyless and straightforward compared to Goldfinger's actual architecture, which is actually, materially very rich, beautifully constructed, full of these quite sort of dramatic silhouettes. As an architect, at the kind of what one would think was one of the most important things about architecture, which is designing very good buildings which last very well, that are well made and nice inside. Goldfinger's kind of unrivaled at the time. I don't think there was a sort of better architect of his kind in the country at the time. So this is one of two high-rise blocks he designed for the London County Council. This one is Trellick Tower in West London, which is still social housing. The other one is not, which is a very long story, which one of the earlier contributors to Reflections on Architecture will know some things about. I will withhold my opinion on that. But the Libetkin, goes through this kind of process of, sort of disappointment and watering down, whereas with Goldfinger, he seemed to have been inspired by the kind of brutalist architects that emerged in London in the 50s and 60s, and seemed to feel that actually the atmosphere there was increasingly freeing, and that he could design much more elaborate and much more dramatic structures in London in the 60s than he could have done anywhere else, which might have been true. But I begin the book with this because it's an architect who doesn't appear on murals, who isn't famous, who will never have a really bad Hollywood film partly inspired by him, which was the recent fate of Ono Goldfinger. You know the film I mean. I hope you know the film I mean. I mean, if you don't know the film I mean and you've not seen it, you're very, very lucky. But if you have seen it, you'll know there's a film about a Hungarian brutalist architect doing the rounds. I don't usually like to name drop, but I'm delighted that I know Ono Goldfinger's granddaughter a little bit. She's an engineer and involved in kind of local politics and the Architecture Centre in Bristol. And she texted me at one point, "I've just seen The Brutalist. What a load of fucking rubbish." I was just like, ha! The actual granddaughter of Ono Goldfinger thinks it's rubbish. But these very mythological, kind of larger-than-life figures are sort of doing the rounds, but they're not really the heart of the story. The heart of the story is loads and loads of people who are doing quite mundane work, often for local authorities, doing very, very straightforward modern architecture. And I want to kind of talk about a few of these, and I'm kind of go through them. So after this one, I'm going to try and go through them nationality by nationality, which is they probably wouldn't have appreciated. So this is St Thomas's Hospital in the centre of London, and it's designed largely by Eugene Rosenberg, who was a Slovak Jewish architect who practiced widely in Prague in the 1930s, emigrated at the end of that decade, went into partnership with the English architect F.R.S. York and the Finnish architect Cyril Mardal. And their firm, York, Rosenberg and Mardal, became one of the biggest British firms of the post-war era, and in a kind of very, very quiet way, one of the best. But in a very, very kind of low temperature, sort of like Bauhaus never ended modernism. Whereas other kind of people that had kind of gone through that experience, like Marcel Breuer, had kind of got increasingly kind of expressionistic and brutalist. Rosenberg stuck to the 1920s program relentlessly throughout his career. It's always 1928 in Prague in Rosenberg buildings, even if it's in 1980 in Belfast. So the reason why I started my kind of project on these émigré architects and artists with this particular building is because of the fact that, I don't know, those of you that know London will probably have gone to the Houses of Parliament at one point or another, on a school trip maybe, as a tourist thing, as children, out of interest, or just from being in that area. Directly opposite the Houses of Parliament, the most insufferably English of all English buildings, a sort of classically planned Gothic building, basically, the ideal kind of English compromise. Directly opposite that building is this. And so you have a Czechoslovak functionalist building, pretty much the same as he would have designed it in the 1920s, opposite the Houses of Parliament. And in front of it, you have a sculpture, a kind of water fountain, sculpture in the form of a water fountain by Naum Garbo, the constructivist artist, who, of course, had also been in Moscow in the revolution and so forth, and, was sort of lived in Britain for a long time, for about 10 years, and kind of was also regarded as a sort of emissary from the artistic and political revolution. And very late in life, Garbo donated the sculpture specifically because of the fact that he lived in Britain during the Blitz and had very kind of sentimental memories of Britain in that time, and donated actually most of his kind of sculptural archive to the Tate at this point. So you've got these kind of, this place where these two kind of radical things from the 1920s, very alien to British traditions and to British architecture. By the 1970s, when this is built, they have become so prominent in public life that they can be right in the centre of the city, opposite the Houses of Parliament. So Rosenberg, this is black and white photographs are not taken by me, which will indicate that I've not been to them. The others are my photographs, which is why they're not very good. And this one, this is one of Rosenberg's houses in Slovakia, in is it a hard or a soft C? Topolčany or Topolčany? Topolčany, thank you. Topolčany. So this is a house of Rosenberg's in Topolčany, and which still survives. Not all of his work from that period does. But it also worked as an architect on the Pensions Institute in the centre of Prague, around the back of the railway station, by Havlicek and Honzik. And that, when I first kind of was in St Thomas's Hospital in London for an ailment, I was incredibly struck by how much the building resembled the Pensions Institute in Prague, which I'd visited a few years before, and kind of for historical reasons. Very similar thing of very precisely cut tiles, very kind of laconic modernism, very non-brutalist, non-expressionistic, non-showy, machine-made, very similar proportions. And I was kind of like, this is such a similar building, before realizing years later that that's because of the fact that one of the architects of that building designed it. So there's a very, very direct connection. But more often, there's a kind of, Rosenberg's interesting because of the fact that he kind of continues, pretty uncompromised, the architecture that he had made in interwar Czechoslovakia. Whereas a lot of the other people I talk about, they go through this process of translation. So this is a building by Michael Rosenauer in Vienna in the 1920s for the Dorotheum auction house as a warehouse. And this is a Rosenauer building of a few years later in London. And you can see, the kind of attempt to sort of do a modernism that kind of compromises with English traditions, with kind of Georgian classical architecture. It's very symmetrical, it's got some stone, it's got some brick. It's kind of trying as hard as possible not to offend people. And Rosenauer was one of kind of many Viennese architects who ended up in London, but he was the first in around 1930. And he was appointed as an advisor on housing by the London County Council, which can often look quite Viennese in some cases. But he wasn't allowed, as was generally the case of emigre architects, to kind of practice in the public sector. So he ended up designing kind of private blocks of flats, mainly for wealthy people. And sometimes if you go inside them, you see what's going on. So you have this kind of, this is the same block. You have this sort of exterior that is very much trying to kind of blend into the English scene, and then an interior where you can sort of see that it's coming from the same sort of era as things like the Wittgenstein house and so forth. So there's a kind of hidden Central Europeanness in some of these buildings. Staying in Vienna for a little bit, I'm going to talk a bit about sculptors because they kind of have a fairly major role in this. And they had a very major role in Vienna between 1919 and 1934 in the so-called era of Red Vienna, in which Vienna becomes really at the kind of forefront of mass socialist housing, frequently with this entire kind of panoply of applied art, so sculpture, mosaic, mauolica, loads and loads, mainly because a lot of artists are unemployed, a very similar thing to what happens with the various arts projects of the New Deal in the USA a little bit later. There was a job creation scheme for artists, essentially, that they would be designing at the heart of these new public housing estates. So this is a sculptural group by Siegfried Scherow in Zürcherhof, in kind of just out the center of Vienna. And I think it's fairly obvious that, if you kind of put this in front of someone that didn't know Vienna or its history and said, do you think this came from a democratic country? or one that was either A, Stalinist, or B, fascist. I think the order that people would respond would be A, Stalinist, B, fascist, C, democratic. Au contraire. In fact, what happens in Vienna is that this democratic socialist government is violently overthrown by the Catholic fascist national government. This is one of the many things that leads to a lot of artists and architects leaving Vienna and going kind of gradually further and further westward until they end up in London and sometimes the USA. And, it's kind of pretty kind of heroic socialist realist stuff, even though it's got nothing to do with the socialist realism that was being declared in the USSR. In fact, it predates it by several years. You would assume it was socialist realism. It's kind of the heroic worker building the future. And then you look at Siegfried Giroux's sculpture about 15, 20 years later, when he's working as a sculptor in London for housing estates for the London County Council. You can see again this process of translation, which is not always a good thing, but in this one I think it's rather a quite attractive kind of transition. So you go from this kind of very, very heavily urban Hof, kind of courtyard-based, street-based, high density, mid-rise, heroic burly workers. And then in the early 50s in London, you have the same sculptor designing, so the sculpture is called Neighbours. And it's just kind of, sort of two blokes taking time off from the building site. It doesn't have any kind of heroism or melodrama to it. It's just this quite relaxed sculpture of two people, two working class people. And surrounding it, this very kind of green, low density-ish, kind of like high-rise, mid-rise blocks in space, in kind of quite abundant green space in Highbury and North London. These kind of shifting political and aesthetic traditions are fairly obvious in that difference. The Viennese architects also have a kind of place in this, because I think that unlike a lot of the German architects of the time, the Viennese architects are very interested in monumentality and very interested in scale, largely because of the fact that they had these very, very large public projects for the city of Vienna, but also because of the fact that the kind of Rotterdam or Berlin or Frankfurt version of interwar modernism is sort of very low density, garden city-like, suburban, slightly boring. So this is a very, very bad photograph of Egon Riss's it's a medical center, I believe, right in the center of Vienna, about 10 minutes walk from Karlsplatz. And Riss moves to London at the end of the 30s, works for a while as a furniture designer, designs a really fantastic kind of mini bookcase for Penguin Books called the Penguin Donkey, which you should look up. A smaller version called the Penguin Gull. And they had these kind of like little plywood bits of furniture, mainly for the Icecon company, which was a sort of lots of Bauhaus emigres were involved in. His architecture in Britain was mainly for the nationalized coal board, whose chief economist, incidentally, who I write about quite a lot, was E.F. Schumacher, who was later famous for the hippie classic, "Small is beautiful." He invents the phrase and kind of a whole load of sort of dropout versions of architecture and gardening and bead selling kind of comes out of that. And at the coal board, specifically the Scottish coal board, Egon Riss designs this series of brutalist mining complexes. So they're enormous, concrete, very, very stark, very, very monumental, and they have entirely disappeared. And this is the only one of which anything survives. A bit of the kind of the air shaft at the back, you can see the kind of convex thing, that still exists. The entire rest of it is gone, like most of the architecture of the British mining industry after its destruction in the 1980s. So Riss is a kind of, one of these sort of people that go through these sort of quite winding paths, and they end up often having kind of moments of prominence, and then their work can literally just entirely disappear. Someone whose work hasn't entirely disappeared, but it's had a kind of ambiguous fate, is the architect Ella Briggs. And there's a new book on Ella Briggs, which, so she's kind of being brought back into prominence somewhat, but one of the most sort of drastic examples of these sort of architectural translations from Central Europe to Britain comes in the work of Ella Briggs. So I've entirely forgotten her maiden name. The Briggs was an American that she married when she briefly worked in the USA in the 20s. And she's one of several kind of designers of high-density Viennese interwar housing. So this is one of the hoofs that she had designed. I can't remember who it's named after, but it's you know in the style. And in the 1940s, she is hired by the philosopher, designer, inventor of isotype, Otto Neurath, and his partner, the designer and sociologist Marie Neurath, who have been hired to help design a new housing estate in an industrial area of the English Midlands in such a way that they would help people to be happier. The Neuraths were very, very kind of against the sort of this is good for you version of modernist planning. The idea that you could kind of eliminate, crime or teenage pregnancy or whatever via housing. They were very kind of, what you can do is create better housing, but you should generally just trust people otherwise. And they were involved in hiring the architect that would design this new housing estate. And what it ended up looking like is this. I wasn't allowed to put this photograph in the book. They were just like, you can't have that in a book. That's just unacceptable. I think this is the most English view I could possibly muster of any place ever. The low-density housing, the kind of slightly unkempt lawns, the kind of gated-off gardens. It's got the lot. Has it got a Union Jack flag? Yes, it has. Oh no, it's got St. George flag in the middle. So it's even got the flag flying. This is what most of Britain looks like. People have other ideas thanks to Harry Potter, but they're wrong. This is what it actually looks like. And sometimes I can feel vaguely nostalgic about that, but there it is. And if you look extremely closely at the housing, you can see that it's actually a Central European housing estate. If you look at these kind of stair towers, that kind of tall glass stair tower, which here are using the original glazing, here the glazing has been ruined, but you can kind of get the idea, the kind of lack of ornament as well, the kind of very, very minimal detail. This is, broadly speaking, something that could have been designed, particularly in Berlin or Frankfurt in the 20s, after it's been kind of gone through the mill of the English construction industry and English tastes, and it's kind of come out looking like this. Anyway, let's have something which everyone likes. There's also a kind of major difference here in the questions of engineering and of technology. And there was already, Britain was a very, very wealthy country in the 1920s and 1930s, probably after the USA, the wealthiest in the world. And it was designing kind of steel frame department stores and factories. There were some kind of concrete buildings in industry mainly. But sort of trying to design this kind of very sort of precision, elegant kind of concrete architecture, it was really, really beyond a lot of English engineers. So this is the Delaware Pavilion in the seaside town of Bexhill-on-Sea. And it's probably one of the only kind of buildings by a famous German modern architect, which is as good as their buildings in Germany. So it's Erich Mendelsohn. After he emigrated, he was in Britain very briefly for about 2 years before he went to Palestine, and then from there to the USA. And it's a kind of public building with a kind of dance hall, a cafe, a concert hall. This was taken when I went to see Throbbing Gristle when they reformed. For those of you who are fans of Throbbing Gristle, they were very good. They did a cover album of Desert Shore by Nico, which is what they were playing. It was a lovely day. Also a very English thing, I think, to see throbbing gristle in a kind of seaside concert hall. But the engineer on this, which is why I'm talking about it, was Felix Samueli, who was a Austrian Jewish emigre who basically knew how to put together the sort of very dramatic, expressionistic modern buildings that Mendelssohn had been designing in Germany, and so was able to kind of get it built properly. One thing that Samueli and Mendelssohn wanted, which wasn't granted in the end, was that the building be clad in ceramic tiles, so similarly to the Havlicek and Honzsik buildings that I was talking about earlier, or similarly to Mendelssohn's German work. But in the end, that was overruled, and so the building needs a lot of upkeep. But when it's well upkept, as it was about 12 years ago when I took this photo, it looks fabulous. Another engineer who is much less discussed than Felix Samueli, who was very involved in the Festival of Britain of 1951, which I write about quite a bit, which was this kind of celebration of Englishness. We seem to do this every few years, have a big celebration of ourselves. But a lot of the people involved in it, of artists and engineers and architects and artists, were among these emigres. And Samueli just kind of engineered most of the buildings. But the guy I want to talk about here is a guy called Kalman Heinel Konyi, who was a Hungarian engineer who came over in the 1930s. And most of his career was spent working in Lincolnshire, in a kind of quite rural part of the English Midlands, for the architect Sam Scorer. And a lot of kind of engineering firsts are kind of done by this architect. It was kind of first kind of paraboloid structures in Britain, at this church, and at this building, which was originally a motor showroom and is now, well, it's now a Nando's. So they have this kind of, very kind of futuristic concrete engineering, which was very, very difficult to do in Britain at the time, but it had been done previously in Hungary, so they were able to do it. Another Hungarian that I want to talk about a little bit, how am I doing for time? Not too bad, is the sculptor Peter Perry. And Peter Perry, so the Hungarians are kind of an interesting part of the story of this book. There's a lot of Hungarians in it, but there are very, very few people who moved from Hungary directly to Britain. What there are, and I'm talking about hundreds of people, are people who went from Hungary in 1919, when they'd frequently been in the very short-lived Hungarian Republic of Councils, which is usually translated not altogether fairly as the Hungarian Soviet Republic. It lasted about 4 months before being overthrown. That they were usually people who had worked for that, and when it was overthrown by a very right-wing government under Admiral Miklos Horthy, they tended to then go to Vienna or to Berlin, and then when kind of right-wing coups took place in those two cities, they would move on from there to Paris or to Amsterdam, and they would then move from there to Britain. So the Hungarians, a very interesting thing, because they had this kind of process of multiple migration. They'd usually kind of been through 3 or 4 countries before they wound up in London. And among them is Peter Perry. Peter Laszlo Perry, to give him his recent biography of him gives him his kind of full name, because he's often known within Central Europe, if he's known at all, for a lot of constructivist work that he designed as an abstract artist in the 20s, particularly working with Bauhaus artists like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. He did lots of these kind of very, very kind of straight down the line abstract constructivist paintings and prints. He then discovered realism and discovered his own material, which he described as pericrete, a kind of homemade form of reinforced concrete, which he used to sculpt his major works. And for a long time, they were very, very neglected in Britain, and they've recently been kind of rediscovered, which I think is a kind of good sign, I suppose. This was designed for the aforementioned Festival of Britain in 1951. It's called Bathers. Actually, it's kind of rather mismounted. You're supposed to look down on it because you're supposed to be looking down on some sunbathers lying on a beach, but instead it's now kind of been suspended at the top, kind of vertically at the top of Waterloo railway station. But it's nice to have it on public display. And he had very, very passionate left-wing politics. He fled Germany because of the fact that he went on a demonstration at the kind of interregnum between the kind of last two German elections, the last free one and the last semi-free one in 1933. And on one of those demonstrations, he punched a member of the Gestapo, which they did not forget when they came to power. So he had to go pretty quick. A lot of his best work, like a lot of this stuff, revolves around social housing and revolves around the very large social housing projects of the London County Council. So there's a particular kind of housing estate in Vauxhall in South London, on an area of kind of ordinary working class homes, which was very heavily bombed in the Blitz because it was close to industry. On a particularly notorious bombing, several children were killed. I think a school was hit. And so his kind of memorials in Pericrete are around this estate, kind of memorializing these children around there. So the Hungarians are one thing, but Czechoslovakia is another, I think, because of the fact that it's one of the kind of four major countries of modern architecture in the 20s. Far more important than France or Spain or Italy, I think, even notwithstanding Britain. But you don't need me to tell you that. That's Colston Newcastle stuff. But they're interested. It's unusual because of the fact that it's the only example I can find where before the rise of fascism in Central Europe, you have an entire project that is based on replicating the Central European modernist urbanist project in Britain. Again, some of you might know this project, but for those that don't, this is East Tilbury in Essex, about kind of 20 miles outside of London, near the docks. And it is a housing development, we're kind of new town, company town, for Bata. So it's a kind of miniature Zlín, basically. It's a sort of miniaturized version of the new town that the Bata company had designed for their workers and employees in Moravia. So, and you can kind of see that. I think, if you're kind of familiar with the kind of Bata company architecture of the late 20s, it's very, very obvious what this is, even if you paint it red and put a St. George flag on it. I wasn't looking for all these St. George flags, they really are everywhere. And it's remarkably uncontroversial. A lot of the projects I'm talking about caused a lot of public opposition. Were kind of major scandals in the newspapers, more conservative architects condemned them. They were political, very kind of hot potatoes. But this one just seemed to just happen. They just seemed to just build this entire company town based on a company town in Czechoslovakia in the modernist style, and it was just built, and no one really talked about it. I think probably largely because of where it was. It wasn't a particularly kind of well investigated area. It's the sort of very, very quiet bit of peri-urban outer London. But that's very much not the case here. So this is the kind of, I guess, a co-production by two emigres from Prague, one of whom was the architect Walter Buchbinder, who changed his name in Britain to Walter Bohr. And Walter Bohr later becomes very, very famous in planning circles for reasons I'll come to in a moment. Like a lot of these people, very, very close to the political left, although not a communist, otherwise he would have gone back. He was very much on the political far left, and he was actually monitored for a while by MI5, who kept an eye on kind of planning professionals who they thought had unreliable politics. But Bohr was very heavily involved in the replanning of the East End of London as a kind of architect planner, as a kind of particular composite type of professional, where they did architecture and planning. This is in Bethnal Green. I think this is planned, if not designed, by Walter Bohr. I'm not 100%. I think it is. And in the foreground is a sculpture by the kind of, I guess kind of populist is how you describe his work, sculptor Frantobelski, who a book was recently published on in Czech. There isn't one in English, actually, even though most of his sculptural career was in Britain. And again, like the kind of Siegfried Scherow estate earlier compared with the one in Vienna, it's this quite sort of cutesy, kind of familial, social democratic version of the socialist future. There's lots of green space, the flats are very pleasant, the sculpture is realistic, but it's not bombastic. And it's rather pleasant. And Bohr later is one of the chief planners of Milton Keynes, the hugely influential, not entirely for good reasons, English new town of the late 1960s, which was kind of the first European city to be planned in almost entirely around the private car, which it does very well, which works fine if you are in a private car. If you're on foot, not always quite so much. Although there are bits of it that are very pleasant on foot, but you have to you have to follow the pre-designed paths, or it's going to be very, very unpleasant, very, very quick. I'm going to end with poles. And poles kind of interest me a lot in this. I was kind of, at one point, considering leaving poles out, because obviously much of Poland was in the Russian Empire in the early 20th century. But half of it was in the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, so I thought I could kind of get away with it. Also, I kind of have I spent a lot of time there in the 2010s. Kind of spent kind of weeks, months at a time on and off in Warsaw. So I can get quite defensive about Poland, and I think its modern architecture of the interwar years is very neglected abroad. So I kind of wanted to redress the balance a bit. But one of the reasons why Poles are very, very tempting to write about is because of the fact that an entire institution of Polish architecture was moved to Britain. So SARP, which some of you may or may not know, the kind of main school of architecture in Warsaw, at the start of the Second World War, when kind of Poles who could made their way west to the Polish army, which was stationed in Scotland, the kind of architectural profession in that particular architecture school was rehoused in Liverpool. So for a long time, Liverpool had the Polish School of Architecture in Liverpool as a thing, until the kind of late 1940s. And classes were taught in Polish. And the kind of, the projects I'm going to show for the next kind of 5 minutes or so are all products of the Polish School of Architecture in Liverpool. And it was highly influential on a particular generation of English modernists who had studied in Liverpool, which would include Colin Rowe, James Sterling, and what they kind of took from it, I think, was they were very impressed by the monumentality of the Polish work, by the fact that it was very, very strongly modernist, but it was also had a kind of quite baroque sense of flamboyance and massiveness and kind of paradox. And obviously baroque is a very, very important thing in Polish architecture. And I guess a sort of greater involvement with history than a lot of the modern architecture that was around at the time, which, you can follow that into Colin Rowe's later work as an architecture historian of the sort of collage city idea. So this is one of many drawings from a book published in 1946 of the work of the Polish School of Architecture. This was a competition for a new town hall on the site of one that had been bombed in Crosby, just outside of Liverpool, by an architect called Jerzy Wyczyński. And most of his work, he settled in Britain. Most of the people settled for life in Britain. They were probably more than any of the other groups of immigrants very, very firmly anti-communist. More likely in some cases to be politically conservative, although not always. In many cases actually not at all, but the kind of general culture around this, and the kind of the Polish emigre culture that thrived in Britain from the 40s until the 90s, could tend to be very kind of heavily Catholic, heavily nationalistic, big moustaches, big estates somewhere in Belarus and Ukraine that they like to remember. That kind of particular aristocratic version of what Polishness is was kind of replicated in London and Birmingham and Southampton and other places and lots of Scotland. In in those decades. But it also had a very major role for modern architecture. And the churches that these Polish architects designed, of which there are many, are interestingly quite similar to the churches that are being designed from the mid-60s onwards within communist Poland, after the kind of, essentially the kind of block on designing new churches ends. Particularly in the 70s and 80s, enormous quantities of them are built, and they're in this kind of particular manner that kind of combines, I guess, sort of Mexican muralism and Oscar Niemeyer and Le Corbusier and a whole load of things. He's got quite a hot mess a lot of the time of different kind of formal ideas, often with kind of very, very dramatic representational art. So this one here by the muralist Adam Kosowski. This is the Polish Millennium Center, built for the millennium of the conversion of the Poles to Christianity in the 1960s in Birmingham. And it's pretty typical kind of Anglo-Polish modernism of the 60s. On one level, it's very, very straightforward, kind of quite industrial modernism in a very, very industrial area, kind of, brown brick, flat roofs, concrete frame. But, there's also the sculpture of our Lord Jesus Christ and, King of Poland, and the Christ of Nations is kind of also kind of very prominent within it. There's the obligatory 4, I think, plaques to people that were massacred at Katyn Forest by the Soviets, an event which at that point was still officially denied by the Soviet Union. But as architecture, it's not traditional. It's still very much in a kind of municipal, ordinary 1960s modernist style. There are also Polish planners who are working in the middle of this. And my favorite of these, I think probably the most interesting Polish planner, well, not even Polish planner of any kind in the 60s in Britain, was a guy called Konrad Smigielski, who took over in Leicester, a very kind of ordinary Midlands town at the time, which is now, I believe, the single most diverse place in Europe. The single most ethnically diverse place in Europe is Leicester. I like to remind people of this. Often, people always sort of imagine the sort of global city as, Manhattan or, London or San Francisco or, Rio or whatever. Like the global city is often Leicester. And he did this really kind of fabulous plan for Leicester in the 60s, that it was going to have a monorail and it was going to have a walkway system and it was going to have all of these incredible things. And it was going to have an inner ring road. Needless to say, only really the inner ring road ever got built. That's how a lot of British planning worked at the time. But he wrote this wonderful text that went along with these illustrations for his plan, in which you really kind of get the sense that for him, he's kind of going, why is Leicester not like Krakow, where he was from? In Krakow, even though the weather is similarly terrible, people sit outside and they drink coffee, and there's this coffee house culture, and they kind of walk around the city for pleasure. Nobody does this in Britain. And in the 60s, that was probably true. Nobody did do that in Britain. What can we do in order to create this? And so his main plan was to kind of keep cars out of the city centre as much as possible. But also to kind of try and encourage conviviality in British life, trying to encourage this kind of, culture of sort of pavement cafes and so on to emerge, which kind of has, belatedly. But this is his last major town planning project. And at this point, he's kind of become quite disenchanted with the results of kind of big planning modernism after the war. The more imaginative ideas that he had weren't carried out in Leicester. The more boring ones of the big new road for the cars were. So he kind of undergoes this kind of 1970s kind of quasi-hippie conversion and designs this new self-sufficient agricultural modernist village, which is going to be self-sufficient via wind power and solar power. It's going to make its own vegetables, and it's going to be in these kind of quite lovely little kind of high-tech houses. And this is the mid-70s. This is pretty advanced stuff. So I'm kind of fascinated really by the fact that these people can sometimes seem extremely of their time, and then suddenly they'll do a project that just seems 50, 60 years ahead of where we are now in many cases. And I want to end with 2 projects by Polish architects, which are built for local authorities as social housing, as so many of the projects I've been talking about have been. One of which is very much not under threat, the other of which is. So this is the first by one of the alumni of the Polish school in Liverpool, Magda Borowiecka, who, unlike most of the people I write about in this book, most of the people I write about are dead. Magda Borowiecka is not dead, so I had to be careful what I said. I mean, I wouldn't need to be polite. I think that her architecture is mostly quite interesting. Most of it in a very kind of low-rise, high-density style, quite kind of pleasant little clusters of villagey housing in brick. And yet she's best known for this enormous block in the centre of Brixton, and one of the most kind of dense and kind of, sort of dramatic bits of London, really. The reason why it looks like this is that it was originally going to have a kind of elevated freeway running across it, which would carry cars past at all times. So the inside of the block has quite large windows, big kind of balconies and terraces, and is quite kind of picturesque. And the frontage that was going to face the motorway, that's where the bathrooms and the kitchens are, and it's kind of treated as this kind of continuous barrier. And it's since been nicknamed by everyone in Brixton as the Barrier Block, had a major role in the riots that happened in Brixton in the 80s and 90s. It was very much on the so-called front line at the time. The Metropolitan Police did not enjoy policing it. But it's nowadays, I think, a fairly kind of like, almost sort of iconic bit of Brixton. You see it appear on things, like a lot of the Goldfinger and Libetkin buildings. You see them appear on kind of tea towels and murals and so on. And you see that also at the Barrier Block, that people start to kind of use it as an image of Brixton to celebrate Brixton. But the motorway wasn't built, so this just faces an ordinary row of shops. So it's this really incongruous urban experience. But still a kind of very, very powerful, monumental work of public architecture. But the one I want to end on is a project by Alina Bolesławicz, who practiced mainly for the London County Council with her partner Noel as Noel and Alina Moffat. And her work, again, is in this kind of quite kind of heavy, brutalist, kind of expressionistic style, very much in that kind of the way the Polish school, it's got this kind of paradoxical element, it's got this element of Baroque, it's got a great deal of complexity, it uses these very kind of raw and rough materials, and it's not in great condition. And a lot of this architecture was built for a very particular dispensation politically. Most of it was built for the public sector of a broadly kind of mixed economy of a social democratic era, an era in which most housing was designed by local authorities outside of the market, outside of the kind of market for housing. It was, I don't like to call it subsidized because this stuff usually pays for itself over time, but it was housing that was very much within the state and outside the market. For an overwhelmingly working class clientele most of the time. And the architects involved took that fairly seriously, even if they were, as all the Poles were, extremely anti-communist. They were very much committed to this particular idea of public architecture and committed to the post-war welfare state. Kind of as well they might, in many ways, given that that had given them shelter and work and projects. But obviously a lot of that architecture in Britain, as in other places, hasn't had money spent on it for the last 40 years. Very, very little of it has been built for the last 40 years. The right to buy council housing, which was brought in, meant that there was less and less of it, that then started to be sold on the free market. And the housing, due to the fact that the local authorities maintained it, and they themselves had less and less money because they were able to tax businesses much, much less than they were able to. That kind of cap was put on the amount they could raise. Meant that these things just started to kind of become dilapidated, and that then became a very convenient excuse for, well, why don't we just demolish them and build, nice new free market housing complexes, which maybe might have a bit of affordable housing as well, which usually isn't built. The affordable housing is, and when it is frequently affordable, is defined as something like 80% of market rent. And most of the people that live in blocks like this, they can't afford 80% of market rent. So they get moved on elsewhere. They're going to go elsewhere in the borough, or elsewhere in London, or frequently they're moved out of London altogether. So this particular block is supposedly going to be demolished in the next year or so. It hasn't been yet. But that kind of sense that, during the Cold War, you have these very kind of strict divides that people like to imagine, that there's kind of, there's the free market here and there's the state there. There's state socialism here and there's kind of liberal capitalism there. And to a degree, those divides have some salience. I mean, there's a reason why these people didn't go back home in most cases. They were not generally, supportive of the Marxist-Leninist regimes that were in power in their countries. Although some were, like Ono Goldfinger. But most were not. But nonetheless, that didn't necessarily mean that they had this kind of American idea that the only alternative is untrammeled capitalism or the kind of iron fist of the state. And most of the work, these emigres from what had become by that point, had become so-called communist Europe by that point, what they were actually doing throughout was designing public projects for the public sector. And sometimes even sort of designing kind of heroic socialist sculptures in the middle of it. There's all sorts of other directions I could go in with this, but I'm going to stop right there. So thank you.
Owen, thank you. Thank you so much, and also for touching Eddie and those, I would say, very important questions of affordable housing and all the other stuff around the welfare state and socialist state, etc., etc. So, yeah, are there any questions from the audience side? So if there are any, please just raise your hand, or I don't know if we have Slido working. If yes, then what? I don't know what kind of signs was that. Questions? Oh yeah. Okay, there are some written questions. Can you just?
This is from the Slido app in our classroom. There are two questions. The first one is, did Czechoslovakia do anything better than Britain in mass housing construction? And should we consider reviving cheaper, standardized housing estates today?
I got the first one. So the first one is, did Czechoslovakia do better than Britain in mass housing construction?
Yes.
And the second?
Should we consider reviving cheaper, standardized housing estates today?
I mean, yeah, I think we should. So the first one, I think it really, really varies. I think actually, so I think in order to sort of speak about this sort of thing from any authority, you have to have been inside the buildings. And I haven't ever been inside the housing estates built after the war in Czechoslovakia, so I don't know what the flats inside are like. So I'd be loath to kind of make generalizations about them. I have been in those in Poland, and I have been in those built at the same time in bits of the USSR, so in Ukraine, Estonia, and in Latvia. And I found them to be much less good inside than the British ones. As is probably obvious from this talk, I'm not really particularly patriotic about much of British life. But the housing inside of a lot of the kind of big projects in Britain at that point is generally very, very good. You generally get dual aspect, you get quite a lot of space, you get a lot of storage. Whereas a lot of the ones that I've been to in Poland, for instance, are single aspect. The ones that I've been to in the USSR are much, much smaller. So sometimes the layouts can be more interesting because they're bigger. You can have kind of more fun with them in a way. But if they're anything like the Polish projects, I'd say they're probably not as good. But they might not be, because obviously Czechoslovakia was richer than Poland at that point. The other one, I think, I wouldn't necessarily, like, the projects that I'm always kind of like, this is how you can do it. I always kind of point people to the so-called Million program in Sweden. Because I think that they kind of hit the exact sort of sweet spot of mass production and quality, which is very, very difficult to do at once. And I think when you're faced with a very, very large problem with housing, which I think, in most European cities we are. In most European cities there's a major crisis of housing affordability, and also a major crisis of housing quality. A lot of what there is dilapidated, and a lot of what's built that's new is quite low quality. So I think it's eminently, a good idea to build a load of good, low-cost municipal housing. But you wouldn't want to do it in exactly the same way. I think those estates, they had flaws. Prefab construction is not always the best way to do these things in terms of the amount of maintenance that you later need. I mean, one thing I will say about post-war housing in Slovakia and Czech Republic and Poland in particular that is better than Britain is that panel housing is better looked after than it is in Britain. I think largely, because almost everyone's kind of lived in it at one point or another, but also because of so there's less stigma. But I think also because of the fact that there was a massive bit of a EU budget to pay for it, so there was a load of money that was allocated to sort your housing out, and they did. And we've never had that in Britain. So, I mean, in fact, the nearest thing we did have was a program in the 2000s called the Decent Homes Program, which largely led to thousands of blocks being covered in what turned out to be flammable cladding, leading most famously to the Grenfell Tower disaster. So our record of renovating concrete housing is not good. We could definitely learn a lot from how it's done here. And people complain about, I don't like the pastel colours, piss off. Like, what would you rather? It's in pastel colours or it's on fire. I don't get the hostility, actually. I kind of get it sometimes when there's a more sort of sculptural work of modern architecture. There's a particular housing estate in Wrocław in Poland where it got clad, and I was really and I felt it had really kind of ruined a lot of it by cladding it. But mostly I'm fine with it if it's done well, which it, and if it's safe. But in terms of like, should we build loads of it? I think in some places it's very much needed. And I think a lot of the housing problems in Europe are also to do with regional inequality. So a lot of the time it is kind of not always a problem of housing supply as housing distribution, let's say. London and New York, for instance, have loads and loads of empty housing and loads of people living in overcrowded housing. So, the obvious thing is kind of like, well, let's get hold of that empty housing first. But yeah, I think there should be a lot more of it.
One more question. I would just have a small comment on the housing in the 70s and 80s here in Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was really in a better quality than if you compare it with Soviet Union or even with Poland. That also let's say the layouts of the flats been very good. Not designed, but rethink that the people really worked on this kind of standardization quite a lot of years, so the result was not that bad. And even if you compare it today with the new housing stock, those prefabricated houses have much better solutions. So
okay, interesting.
There was a second question. First off, starting with, are you aware or have you visited the brutalist SMP memorial in Banska Bystrica, the one by Dusan Kuzma? The question is, what do you think of the architectural artifact, as a tool of a political memory and monument?
So I know of it, but I've not been to it. The only place I've been to in Slovakia is Bratislava, and this is my third time in Bratislava. But I've not been. I really should have. But I know the project, so yeah, I mean, I guess I was sort of trying to get at that a bit by talking about sculpture, that actually you can find quite a lot of sort of representational kind of political sculpture in the so-called West in the kind of 50s and 60s and 70s. So I wanted to kind of draw attention to that. But a project like the one, like the SMP building, it's much more dramatic. It's telling an entire kind of political tale through its architecture. And again, it's a thing I'd have to see firsthand to have direct comments on that. But it really depends. I remember when in Kiev they started kind of reorganizing and renaming the kind of World War II museums in the last few years. I had a real feeling of like, I might not like this, but it's not my place to argue. I didn't particularly like them doing it, partly because of the fabric of the buildings, partly because I thought the new narrative they were imposing was no more true than the one they were getting rid of. But yeah, I just felt very much like this argument isn't for me to make.
Some more questions from people here. Yeah.
Good evening. I wanted to ask about the because you've shown us like different examples of different architects that immigrated to UK, and of course there were like individual personalities with their own work and different life stories. But I wanted to know if like how much do they matter in the like big picture of the 20th century UK architecture? Like if you put the whole narrative, can you talk about something like the migration wave of architecture, or like the way that like how they are perceived and interpreted in the storyline of the 20th century British architecture?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think until probably about 10 years ago, the story was that they changed everything, that they changed absolutely everything. And that if you didn't have Lübeck and Goldfinger and Mendelssohn and Gropius and Breuer moving to Britain, we would never have had a real modern architecture. And there was a book published a few years ago called Bauhaus Goes West by the architectural historian Alan Powers that tried to argue that this wasn't actually true. And when I was putting this book together, I was kind of aware that some historians now are going like, maybe it's not that simple. And then I read it, and I kind of went through the kind of research that I did, and I thought, no, it is that simple. That really, without that wave of migration, there would not have been a serious modern architecture in Britain. And there really wasn't before they started arriving. At best, you had a handful of people in London doing very, very small projects and publishing things in the magazine. So there was like a translation of Le Corbusier's Ver in Architecture, for instance. There were like a couple of articles in the press about the Bauhaus. There was a couple of private houses, but really, really, really small scale stuff. And then these people come over and that caused this enormous cultural change. And by the 70s, the energy of that starts to run out. It's not coincidental, I don't think, that it's at that point that you start getting, that sort of generation of sort of famous English modernists that work a lot abroad, sort of James Sterling and Richard Rogers and Norman Foster. They kind of come out of a sort of architectural education that is often quite dominated by emigres. And they kind of come out of it and, they're sort of much more marketed as English and seen as English, first and foremost. But their fingerprints, until I'd say the mid-70s, are on almost everything. It's like as decisive, I think, as the migration to the USA at the same time. And whereas the USA migration largely changes, cinema in particular, I think architecture is the one that's really decisively changed in Britain. Also cinema to an extent, but yeah, I really can't be exaggerated at how important it was, I don't think.
No, actually it should be added that it was not only about practicing architects, but also the main, let's say, figures of the architecture history, as Nicholas Pevsner, who actually wrote the story about the modern architecture. He was an emigre as well, so this was like a whole body of people who did this change. But there was a question.
Hi. Thank you for your lecture, first of all. And second of all, at the beginning of approximately in the first third of your lecture, you mentioned that, I think it was Rosenberg, that even though he worked in the UK later on, his architecture still looked like as if it was built in 1928 in Prague, right? And you said something similar about some other architect as well. And this is something that I noticed that keeps coming back in terms of Slovak architecture as well, that we have certain personalities that came up with this, let's say, magic trick or with this recipe early on in their career, and they keep pulling the same rabbit out of the hat over and over again. And I was just wondering if you could comment more on that, because I personally don't know if it's something that we should loathe and we should be critical about. Of course, I'm oversimplifying architecture right now, but what do you think about this phenomenon that keeps coming and back?
Yeah. I think it depends how seriously these people took the 1920s, I think. So I think that for a lot of people, and actually Nicholas Pevsner was one of them, the historian Nicholas Pevsner was definitely one of them, who really did think that the problems about architecture had largely been solved in the 1920s. And that modern architecture was this rational, fairly kind of replicable thing that had been discovered in Central Europe in the mid-20s, and you could just keep doing it. It didn't need to be updated any more than classicism needs to be updated. You discovered a style and you kept building it. And Pevsner was very kind of hostile to brutalism because of the fact that he saw it as bringing back all the things the 1920s wanted rid of, irrationality, monumentality. This was what they were fighting, what they thought the kind of modernism was, as far as they were concerned, to stop, was, big cantilevers that don't do anything, and, kind of raw brick and, things that don't make rational sense. So, as someone that likes looking at buildings, I think it would be a shame if we had all kept building like we did in 1928 forever. But I think that those that thought that we should do that had this it was sort of a mark of their sincerity in a way, as much as it was of their lack of imagination. That they really, really did believe in what they were doing. And I think Rosenberg really, really did believe in what he was doing. But a lot of the other people I'm talking about were much more willing to, develop their architecture in all kinds of different directions that wouldn't have been around in the 20s. So, yeah, it varies. But yeah, Rosenberg is a real outlier for me because it's just the pure style just keeps being built. And you can recognize them instantly, and there's dozens around, usually hospitals, and you can just spot them and like, yes, Rosenberg.
I mean, he was also lucky to have a good clients to accept this kind of European way of designing, because some of them, they're not that lucky. If I remember some of the immigrants from Slovakia, like Josef Konrad or Oskar Singer or others, they've been complaining that they were forced to do this kind of British traditional architecture. But what was the most, the biggest obstacle? You know what was the biggest obstacle? shifting from the metric system to yards. This was like they were been always complaining, this is something, but it's quite difficult.
I still think in it, and I was born in the 80s.
Yeah, okay, but lastly, perhaps we can come to the phenomenon of emigres as it is, because I mean, this was not the only one wave of emigres coming from Europe or from Central Europe to UK. We have 50s from Hungary, then we have 60s from Slovakia, perhaps 70s Poland, and because all of these social collapses and small revolutions, and then the big wave after 1989. And I was like, it was so nice to hear you talking about the Polish emigres from the 30s. But when you compare it with the last wave of the Polish immigrants, the discussion was completely different. So perhaps we can touch this topic of emigration as well.
Yeah, I mean, Poles are interesting because there was many more of them, for one thing. So, you know, I grew up in a provincial city in the south of England, and loads of the people I knew when I was growing up were from the sons or daughters or grandsons and grandchildren, you know, granddaughters of Poles had come over in the 40s. And I didn't know anyone who'd come over from Hungary or Germany or Austria or Czechoslovakia. But the Poles were everywhere. Even before the 2000s, they were already a really big part of urban life in Britain. All pretending to be aristocrats, even when they were like working in shipyards or mines. And that's the funny thing, the later generation is much more obviously working class, whereas the 40s emigres all acted like they had like a big estate in the Kresy. And, you know, like the Polish restaurants that you have there are all very much kind of like, you know, Jagiellonian. I had a real... It was a real question for me of where I was going to draw the line. And I knew I was going to draw the line geographically, but where I was going to draw the line temporally, like, mainly really just because it would have been impossible to know where to stop. But I was very, very tempted for a while to talk about the particular kind of Poles and Czechoslovaks that were over in the 60s. So Dalibor Vesely, Josef Rikvert. Actually, he came in from the 30s, which I only recently realized when he died. I thought he came much later. So I didn't write about Rikvert. But actually, if I'd known Rikvert came out from the 30s, I would have written about Rikvert. But Rikvert, Zygmunt Bauman, Leszek Kołakowski, and particularly the Bauman-Kołakowski difference really fascinates me, because politically, they arrived in the same place politically, and they both drift in totally opposite directions. And my theory on this is entirely because Kołakowski got a job in Oxford and Bauman got a job in Leeds. And that's why. That's why Kołakowski became right-wing and Bauman stayed a leftist, is that like he went to an industrial city and Kołakowski went to Oxford, and they corrupt you in Oxford. And the Hungarians, you know, as well, like they came over and after 56. There's loads and loads of people, and I just had to have a kind of like, you know, a line. And that line was going to be 1945. And I let in 2 people who came in 46, because I just thought they were too interesting to leave out. And I thought 45, 46, who cares? But yeah, I was never going to bring it up to the EU accession. But I was for a while going to bring it up to 68, and then I was like, nah.
Next book. Yeah. Okay, are there some more questions regarding architecture, emigration, or whatever, social housing? You have the right person here. He can answer all your questions. If not, then I would like to thank you very much for this very nice overview of those incredible people who've been lucky enough to leave Europe and move to islands and start a new life there. So thank you. It's quite inspirative also for nowadays. Thank you very much, Owen, for being with us, and thank you, dear audience, for your attention.